So that was Tarkovsky's The Sacrifice. Um, I actually read this was his last film before he died. Um, and so I don't know. I think there's always a tendency to sort of see it as a kind of like summary piece. But well, I don't know. We'll get to that in a little bit. But yeah, maybe Guy, you can start with telling me about your impressions of the film.
Yeah, I mean that there is a sort of like it's the obvious reading of the film. I can't remember if this was it's either John Berger ways of seeing or it's some random PowerPoint I saw in art high school, but it's like look at this picture of crows in a field and this was the last painting and now I tell you that this is the last painting that Van Gogh painted before he died and you're supposed to have this like whoa moment where the meaning completely changes. And I think with The Sacrifice it's very much sort of inflected by concerns around, you know, mortality and redemption and creating something durable in the world, which can be seen as like, you know, a response to an awareness of your own mortality or something. But those are very much like the core concerns of Tarkovsky's films from the outset, I would say. But you do get this sense as well. So the action takes place in this like sort of idyllic wooden house in a kind of remote island in Sweden where this retired actor turned critic Alexander is hosting it's his birthday party. A kind of very odd cast of guests have come together to join him alongside his family. And the first half of the film is basically these just like intense philosophical monologues where you just get like detail after detail and detail. And there's so many symbols and there's so many references and they're just piled in. And I think that's something where you maybe do get the sense of, it's almost as if Tarkovsky's like, okay, got to get it all out and like, got to get it all in this one. And it's overwhelming, but in a very pleasant way. Like, oh, wow, look at that. Wow, look at that. Wow, look at that. Which isn't something that I think is typically the case with Tarkovsky, where often you've got these very long, slow shots, and those are all still here very much. But there's also this kind of like constant excess of symbols and references and kind of small parables or references to philosophy that are constantly being spoken about in the first half of the film before the sort of axial turn, which maybe you can speak to.
Well, I think what's interesting in that first segment is it actually takes a while for you to realize who's actually speaking because the shots are from so far away. For a while, I was sort of wondering if this was Alexander in shot or if this was a kind of narrator. And I think, kind of speaking to your point about trying to cram everything in some ways, it had a little bit of that, and especially when you know, the very, very last shot where you actually see that very kind of moving personal note from Tarkovsky dedicating this film to his son. There is a little part of me that sort of feels as though that these kind of monologues, these meditative, parables, as you say, are kind of directed at him, maybe, not in perhaps like a particularly didactic way, but a sort of handing over of all the stuff maybe that's still not quite made, hasn't quite clarified in Tarkovsky's mind, and maybe just getting it down in some way. But I think I'm interested that you call the house idyllic because the house itself is quite idyllic, but I actually found the area around it quite barren. It's almost like we're back in the zone in Stalker, but the kind of there's been some kind of like nuclear apocalypse and all the trees have lost their leaves and there's always something so Tarkovskian about like bits of water everywhere. Like I'm never quite sure. Like, has it just rained? Is it coming from beneath? But there's something zone-ish about the setting that, yeah, I think that actually spoke to like a wider point that I felt that The Sacrifice, even though I don't think it is this kind of like magnum opus, this kind of summary of his philosophical ideas. I still think it is really in conversation with so many different of his, and you know, I'm by no means a Tarkovsky expert, but I'm coming from this as someone who has seen quite a few of his films in the last year. And so Mirror was one that really I felt was kind of very, very connected to it, in that it's a film which is very much based around a house. It's a family story. It's about intergenerational connection, disconnection, and I can't help but see that image of the floating body above the bed that is so, you know, so prevalent in both films. So it felt like, yeah, there's, and then all these other kind of connections to, I mean, Andrei Rublev, the very opening credits of the film, we start by looking at a painting, and I thought, you know, this really speaks to the ending of Andrei Rublev, where you're lingering over these paintings and art. So yeah, I found that really enjoyable, and of course, it's you know, very tempting, I think, to try and find these sort of
Yeah.
meanings, perhaps. But I think it just very much feels like we're in the world of Tarkovsky and his associative meanings and the kind of symbolism that he likes to use.
No, for sure. And I think there's sort of like a film buff uh, approach to these sort of things sometimes, where it's like, oh yeah, if you like look really closely in this shot, there's this reference to this thing, and I've spotted this, and I posted about it on some weird subreddit somewhere.
Yeah.
So you can like, and it's just kind of self-congratulatory and baseless. It's just like, oh, I'm a director and I've made reference to some other thing so that some person who wishes they could be me can watch this film and get it. And that's very much not the case here, where the reoccurrence of these symbols and references, as I think about Tarkovsky zeroing in on these like very fundamental concerns, which he returns to time and time again. I mean, that's maybe a good linking point to like the subject matter of the film itself, where it's all about this kind of intense sort of like sacrifice that Alexander undertakes to, where after kind of praying that the creator might spare the world lest he kind of abandon all that he loves after news of nuclear war has arrived at the house, he kind of receives a strange set of instructions from his friend, the postman Otto, and sleeps in Maria, this witch, which is the scene you were mentioning earlier. And he's very much like kind of immersed in this like completely irrational set of actions, which nevertheless seem to have this intuitive magical power that we kind of take for granted. And I think what Tarkovsky's getting at there is that there's this kind of this irrational commitment that gives acts like that power, or the potential significance that they have, where you're doing something and you don't quite know what its possible significance might be, but you're nevertheless committed to its kind of ceremonial power. And that's there at the beginning of the film as well, when Alexander is planting a tree while his son, Little Man, watches and plays, and tells this parable about this monk who plants a dead tree on the mountainside and instructs his pupil to return to it every day for 3 years and water it. And he does this, and then finally, after 3 years of doing this every day and visiting this tree and sitting with it and watering it and doing the same again and again, it springs to life and is covered with blossoms. And there's a sense of that in Tarkovsky's approach to cinema as well, right? Where it's about this, the power comes through the repetition and the reoccurrence and the return to these themes. And this idea that you can return to something and uncover something new in it. Even just in this like ideas about time and cinema is this thing that gives form and duration to something that's like otherwise fleeting, and kind of makes it something that's concrete and communal and can be experienced by, can like linger and exist beyond you. And that's kind of, you see that a lot in the film in terms of both the reoccurrence of symbols and this kind of intense excess of symbolic meaning, which is very ritualistic in a certain sense. And then you also see it, I think, in terms of the way, you know, the way sort of Alexander is willing to abandon all that he cares about, disconnect himself from his life and all that he cherishes, in an act of devotion to kind of collective survival. And I think that devotion to something that's kind of beyond you and bigger, I feel like this has turned into such a like undergrad philosophy rant bit, whatever.
No, this is brilliant. Yeah, I think it makes sense
is
following it. Yeah.
is really essential, and I think the thing that I found really moving about the film, because it's quite abstract and there's quite a strong sense of artifice. It feels a bit like a set piece, where there's something very stage-like about the house and the settings. And as you're saying, when I said it was idyllic, I think that's maybe more what I was getting towards, where it's not beautiful, but it's sort of like this platonic ideal of a space, or like a kind of computer rendering where everything that needs to be there is there, nothing more than that. And that's definitely a concern of the film as well, where there's a couple, I'll stop talking now because I'm talking for too long, but there's a couple of references where that comes through as well, where he talks about Otto gifts him this map of this kind of medieval map of Europe on his birthday, and he's kind of questioning whether it's authentic or whether it's fake or not. And that there's this kind of constant concern with I can't mind this down now.
No, I maybe I could come in there, because I think that concern between the real and the artificial perhaps is something that I really noticed throughout, especially I think when as I think we enter, and after the turn where this kind of news of nuclear apocalypse is happens, things start getting quite weird and quite peculiar, and I think you start to kind of lose that sense of stability cinematically. You're wondering, are we in a dream sequence? Are we in just sort of are we being pressed through Alexander's distorted consciousness? And and then he gets these strange sort of instructions, then he goes to Maria, and then he comes back and he kind of wakes up. And at that point I remember wondering whether this has all been a dream, whether this has actually happened. And it actually really reminds me of in Stalker when the three kind of come back to the bar, and they're kind of where they started, and you're kind of wondering, okay, I'm looking for evidence here that he actually has been through this kind of ordeal. But there's a few other things that I wanted to come in on. And when you mentioned it's very sort of theatrical, and the house is very stage-like, I think that's so true. I think there's this really kind of rich choreography to that sequence. I think it's the kind of second long kind of episode where the kind of these monologues are kind of being rotated around, and in that very stalker-ish way, the camera is kind of slowly scanning, and you kind of forget about characters, and then as soon as the camera turns, you realize they've been there all along. And I think there's a really kind of something very theatrical about that. And what was the one thing I wanted to come back on to you as well was where you talking about rituals, talking about the idea of making things. And I always get the sense in a Tarkovsky film that whatever the character's talking about, they're kind of always talking about filmmaking as well. Like I think in one of the early parables, Alexander, speaking to Little Man, talks about sin is whatever is unnecessary.
Yeah,
I think that's such the.
I made a note of that as well.
That has to be about filmmaking or creating, or killing your darlings. This kind of creative process, and I think what really comes across in the film that I think links to a lot of other Tarkovsky films is this kind of existential bind poets and writers and artists find themselves in, where they've been sort of put on this earth with an instinct to make things, but the making always seems to lead to destruction. And I think that's symbolized in the story that Alexander tells to Maria about the garden that he wants to make, and as soon as he makes it, it's hideous and it's ugly and it's not at all how he intended. And I just feel like there's some of Tarkovsky's own kind of inner conflict, that this will to life, and that somehow this will to life always leaves a kind of a wake of destruction. It kind of comes through, and particularly in this film, when we the final images are is a house burning down. I mean, what could be more kind of, you know, it feels like it's a very dramatic example of, you know, writing something and tearing it up, you know.
Yeah, but I mean, it's also like he's putting this film together in exile. He can't see his son, who's stuck in the Soviet Union while he's off in Sweden, kind of, you know, cobbling together funding to continue his career. And yeah, that, I mean, that trade-off is very much driving the film, I think, in some sense. So there's, on the one hand, it's very, as I was mentioning earlier, directly biographical, in that sense, where you can look at what was going on in Tarkovsky's life in terms of exile and illness and so on and so forth, and see how that comes through. But then there is also, as ever, this kind of concern with these, like, you know, this kind of these eternal questions of art making and creation and time and all, like, you know, all these like capital letter words. But with regard to that act of making, I think there was one, hopefully I won't fumble this one, but there was one other kind of like small reference quote thing that I really liked early on, where Alexander's paging through this book of medieval art, and he's like just sort of awestruck with these paintings, and he's using these like really kind of generous but also quite vacuous like adjectives, like simply splendid, like how innocent but still so unique, or whatever. And it's kind of like, you know, this like art undergrad essay type of thing. And then he stops doing all that and he calls it, he looks at the painting and he calls the painting an act of prayer, I think, or something along those lines. I can't quite remember the quote, but it's something to that extent. And I think that's something that's really key in this film, and which sort of plays into both the kind of apparent delusory nature of Alexander's actions as he, you know, goes to the extent to burn down his house to kind of prevent the apocalypse, which, you know, taken in a vacuum is clearly mad, like, you know, seems quite deeply irrational and delusional. And with the kind of the sense of artifice that pervades the film otherwise, where, you know, as he's doing that and burning down the house, there's this ambulance which is just seemingly like already parked outside, and there's all these weird moments of discontinuity, where there's another really great one where he's having a conversation with Otto, and Otto's standing just behind him, and then suddenly Otto's breath starts to like perspire and form a small opaque patch on this glass, and you suddenly realize that he's been outside the whole time. And there's all these moments where the kind of the artifice of the world is foregrounded in this very explicit way. And when you then turn that back to creating a painting, to create like a representation of reality, to kind of, you know, fumble it as this act of prayer, it feels like there's something that's quite fundamental in a way, right? Where it's about this process of creation, which is bound to failure, which distorts the world, but also kind of makes it livable and gives it meaning. Yeah, I don't know.
As you're saying that, I'm reminded of the scenes as well where there are certain points where the characters look directly into the camera.
Yeah,
they you know, they do feel that there is a kind of clumsiness to that, I think, and because you've gone from being a stalker, like a witness in this very Tarkovskian way, peering in, and then you're sort of put on trial a little bit, and so you're always aware that there is this, I suppose, this kind of like instability that art relies on in order to to express. And I think that's actually, there's another little bit where, you know, for the first sort of hour of the film, we have this house as very much the anchor of the film, and then there's a dream sequence where Alexander walks out and he sees this little model house the little man has made, and then suddenly there is this kind of this unsettling, I think, this kind of cosmic instability that represents also, I think, what the characters are all kind of figuring out, you know, how to live, what to do, what's the right way of being, and you feel it as a viewer, I think, this kind of instability, as if you're not quite sure what dimension we're in here. We're not quite sure if what we're seeing is really what we're seeing. And I suppose all those concerns are, you know, what drives this kind of art making in the first place, and Tarkovsky and his films. And then one other thing I wanted to mention was the very last scene and the line, where the man finally speaks. And I suppose of course he's referencing, in the beginning there was the word, and it is a film that is so filled with words, and often words that actually don't, they seem to ring quite hollow a lot of the time. There's a lot of infuriating miscommunication. I mean, that scene when Otto is trying to explain what to do to Alexander is one of the most frustrating things to witness, because they're just speaking different languages, or as if they're in different kind of psychological planes or something. But I suppose there is what I took from that was something to do with wisdom and being in the doing, perhaps, and not just the saying. And I thought, I really did find that the ending very moving, particularly with the that very, very direct biographical intrusion that I don't think that you don't really get actually in such a kind of exposed way.
Yeah, no, I also thought it was really beautiful. And I think it's about that sense of like action and kind of having a sense of fidelity to life, even, and finding a way to navigate that uncertainty. As the kind of and that can go multiple ways. That can end in ruin, it can end in catastrophe, and we don't even quite know whether what we've seen with Alexander doing this like strange set of acts is a kind of heroic redemption which will forever go unrecognized, or if he's just torn his life to pieces in a act of meaningless destruction. But it sort of comes back to that thing, this compulsion, this need to act, to do something, to try do something to kind of make sense of this mess. It makes me think, just as this is all unfolding, and you hear the planes flying above, his wife Adelaide like yells out like, do something. And I think that's the kind of compulsion that drives the film, is that just what that instruction might mean in practice is kind of so ambiguous and unknown, we never quite know, but it's one that we're nevertheless sort of like bound to. But I really loved it.